So, we need to finish the respiratory system. We'll start urinary. And then on Thursday, we'll finish that. Finish our digestion. Remember, your reproductive is not going to be on the next exam. We don't have time to cover it. And what I'm going to do, you have the PowerPoint, you have the notes. I will post one of my old lectures on the reproductive system. If you want to go through it sometime this summer when you miss me and miss my voice and stuff, spend about 3 hours with me on that. I'll post it just so you have it. Overall health care, we have to get through respiratory and urinary. That's key. That's going to be really important. If you're going into OBGYN, then I suggest you take a look at the reproductive. You should probably watch it anyway. Just watch it with a glass of wine. Okay? Just watch it, and obviously you don't have to memorize it. So, if we have time for an IRAC, we'll plug one in. It just depends on how we get through this rest of this material. Respiratory, the rest of the respiratory is an important section, and so is the urinary system. If your kidneys aren't working, you're in deep trouble. It's a big deal. Digestion is important too. How do we absorb and digest our nutrients? So we've got to get through those chapters. So if we have time, we'll get our IRAD in there. If not, we'll just have our last exam. So the last exam will be over 16, 17, and 18, only 3 chapters. 16, 17, and 18. And gosh, that's already next week. It's our last lecture week. Can you believe it? Some of you are thinking, man, I can't believe it took this long. So I know it may feel like I've been torturing you, but first class, you guys that are going into the nursing program, the first class that you take is pathophys. And you log in and they don't review anything in normal physiology. They don't review how the neuron works. They don't review the heart. They don't review ions and depolarization and all that stuff. They immediately go into the diseases. What happens when your sodium is low? What are the clinical manifestations? And that's what you dive into. So, I'm guessing that about next October, you might thank me for the torture that you have survived. Just thinking. So, I would encourage you to keep your notes. Past students have said they go back to the notes, especially for phys, and review stuff. Because if you don't know how the normal physiology works, you ain't going to get the patho. So keep them and review them. All right. So we started the respiratory system the other day, and we got into reviewed a little bit of the anatomy, and I think we stopped at lung volumes. Is that correct? Okay. We covered this in lab, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because we did all this, right? This was the details of what we did in lab. So this is done. However, I'll just review some of the terms. Remember that tidal volume is the air you're breathing in and out while you're sitting here. Inspiratory reserve is that amount of air you can take in above tidal volume. And expiratory reserve is the air you can breathe out after tidal volume. And then we said vital capacity. What's next? Vital capacity is IRV plus ERV plus TV. So those 3 put together. It's the max in, max out. And we measured that in lab. And of course, the taller you are, the bigger you are, the more, male you are, the better your vital capacity, because you got bigger lungs. Residual volume, we said that's the air that cannot leave the lungs. Keeps the lungs inflated. You're good. Keeps the lungs inflated because there's on average average about 1,200 mils. And we talked about the weird equation that, for whatever reason, gives you amazing lung residual volume when you turn 19. And dead space, we didn't talk about dead space. Dead space is the air that never makes it to the alveoli. In other words, it's the last air in and the first air out. It's the air that stays in the bronchioles, the trachea, so it comes in last and it leaves first. So it does not participate in gas exchange. It's only about 150 mils. It's not very much, about like that, if we were to make that air. Not a ton. And then we said, which is not in your notes here, but the total lung capacity or TLC, is all of those combined. So we're going to have, except for dead space, residual volume plus vital capacity. And in men, averages, we said about 6,000, and women is about, total lung capacity is about 4,200. And so, now we're going to move on. One of the things that you're going to work on in the first semester of pathophysiology is something called ABGs. Arterial blood gases. And these are going to be important. When a gas is mixed in liquid under pressure, it dissolves. A gas in liquid under pressure dissolves. Think about a Coke, right? An unopened Coca-Cola or pop that's got the lid on. What happens when you take the lid off? And then it starts to fizz, right? It doesn't fizz while it's sitting there. As soon as you take the lid off, because now you've released the pressure. And when that pressure is gone, then the gas bubbles off. Our blood is under pressure. It's in a closed system in the vasculature, and so it's under pressure. So oxygen and carbon dioxide, the two main gases, are going to dissolve in the bloodstream. Some of the gases are carried in certain mechanisms, some of them are dissolved. So we're going to talk about some of these. A partial pressure is the amount of gas, or the amount of pressure that is exerted in a system with a multitude of gases. If I had a jar, what's the gases in our atmosphere? I remember the gases in our atmosphere. Our atmosphere, I'll just tell you, because I have to remind myself of this. Atmospheric pressure at sea level is about 760 millimeters of mercury. Okay? Anybody know what gases make up our atmosphere? Nitrogen. Of course. Better be, or we can't survive. What? Carbon dioxide. CO2. And the last one you're probably not going to come up with, water vapor. Water vapor. What percentage of our gases do you think is nitrogen in our atmosphere?
A lot.
Which is the most gas in our atmosphere? You think it's carbon dioxide? Nope. 78% of our gas is nitrogen. Anybody know what oxygen is? About 20-ish. It's about 20-ish. CO2 is less than 1. And then water vapor is, sorry. That's not right. It's less than 1, 0.04. And then water vapor is 0.5. So those together make up our atmosphere. So if we took a jar and we just put those gases in a jar, because they're part of the atmosphere, and we put the lid on it, each of those gases exerts a pressure against the jar. So you got nitrogen, you got oxygen, you got CO2, and you've got some water vapor in there. All of those exert a pressure making up the 100%, So each one exerts a partial pressure. So the partial pressure of each of those gases within the closed system added together makes up the 100%. So that's what they use, that's what that partial pressure means. And it's a big P right in front of your gas. So the PO2 is the partial pressure of oxygen in our blood. The PCO2 will be the partial pressure of CO2 in our blood. And those are the two that we're going to focus on directly, because those are the ones that are transported through the body and utilized metabolically. So, remember, hemoglobin. We talked about hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is that big molecule in red blood cells that carries oxygen. And we said that it is a 4 subunit protein. Somewhere I should just keep the dang picture of this up. 4 subunit protein, that all 4 subunits together make up hemoglobin. And in the center of each subunit is an iron ion. And each iron binds
Oxygen.
Each iron binds oxygen. And in our red blood cells, we said we've got at minimum 250 million of each of these filling up our red blood cells. So our red blood cells carry tons and tons and tons of oxygen. And what's the most abundant cell type in our blood? Red blood cells. There's billions of them, right? Absolutely billions. So oxygen's important. And what's oxygen important for? To make
Energy.
See? It's sticking. I'm making it long-term storage here. Repeat it, repeat it, repeat it, right? So what's interesting about hemoglobin is that hemoglobin carries oxygen, right? Hemoglobin is never completely maximized out. If you take your pulse oximeter reading, if you take your oxygen level on a little finger thing, it's never 100%. It's all in the neighborhood of 97, 98. It's never 100%. Partly because hemoglobin can also carry other molecules like CO2. And it can carry hydrogen ions. So, our oxygen is never completely saturated in our oxygenated blood. In our deoxygenated blood, obviously, we're going to have less oxygen because we're going to exchange some of that oxygen for some of these other molecules that we'll talk about in a second. pH and temperature can affect oxygen binding. If your pH is out of whack, especially if you are acidic, then hydrogen is going to bind. We're going to bind hydrogen over oxygen. And then you're not going to carry as much oxygen to your cells, right? If you have high temperature, elevated temperatures reduces oxygen binding. So fevers actually reduce oxygen binding, making it harder to make energy when you have a fever. Other interesting thing about hemoglobin and the ability to carry oxygen as well as CO2 is there's another molecule that it really, really, really likes to bind, and that's called CO. Anybody know what that is?
Carbon monoxide.
Carbon monoxide. So if your hemoglobin has an option, if carbon monoxide is available, this is number one. Hemoglobin will bind carbon monoxide over anything else. And then what?
So you're not getting oxygen to the cell.
And what can't you do? Make energy, and what happens to you?
We die.
Yeah, carbon monoxide poisoning, right? You have too much carbon monoxide in your house, it binds your hemoglobin over oxygen. And one of the things that happens is you get fatigued, you get sleepy, you can't make energy, and if there's too much of it, you can't send any oxygen to your cells, or not nearly enough, and carbon monoxide will kill you.
Well,
scary gas.
What makes the hemoglobin like the carbon monoxide?
It's a tighter affinity binding. It likes the chemistry better. You have to ask the chemist. I do know it's a tighter affinity. It binds harder. All right, now we're going to look at how oxygen and CO2 are transported through the blood, kind of, and what they do as far as gas exchange. Only because I know you miss my artwork. Whoops. That's kind of a big gastric anemia, so we'll make it a little smaller.
Then you're drawing this first. Oh wait, it doesn't. Oh my gosh.
Okay? This is the lung. We'll make it a little bit bigger. I'm not drawing in the heart. We're just gonna do the lung because we're doing gas exchange at the lung and gas exchange at the tissues. So let's start with oxygen first. Blood leaving the heart comes from the lungs, goes to the heart, leaves the heart, goes to the body. Its job is to carry oxygen to the cells, dump it off, right? Exchange for CO2, head back to the heart, back to the lungs, dump off CO2, pick up more oxygen, right? It's the path. So, arteries that leave the heart, that came from the lungs, are heading to the cells, and we're going to feed the cells of the big toe. These guys need oxygen too, right? Those are cells. Big toe. So we're going to send oxygen to these cells. Okay? We're going to dump off the oxygen from the cells, or to the cells. And now we're going to head back to the heart through our veins, which are blue because they're deoxygenated. Correct. Now remember, there's a heart in here that I'm not including. We're just looking at the lung. Okay? Make sense? In our lung, the partial pressure of oxygen, we're talking oxygen only here. We're going to start with oxygen, then we'll do the same thing with CO2. In the lung, the PO2, partial pressure of oxygen, is 100 millimeters of mercury. You breathe oxygen in, oxygen goes to your alveoli. The partial pressure of the oxygen in your lung is 100 millimeters of mercury. The oxygen level in your veins is lower, right? It's deoxygenated. The oxygen, or the PO2, of the venous flow coming back to the lung is only 40. So if you think about diffusion, which way is oxygen going to diffuse at the lung? Higher to lower, right? So it's going to go from the lung, the alveolus, to the capillary, right? Remember, our alveoli are surrounded by the capillaries. So our capillaries coming to the lung are very low in oxygen. It doesn't mean that they're deoxygenated. They always say, oh, it's deoxygenated good. It's not unoxygenated. It doesn't have zero oxygen. It's got much less than half of your arteries. So the PO2 of oxygen in the lung is 100. In the veins, it's only 40. Guess what direction the oxygen's going to go? Into the bloodstream. Think about it like diffusion. It's a pressure gradient, just like diffusion is a concentration gradient. It's a change in pressure from high to low. Think diffusion, same concept. So now, we're gonna send that oxygen into the bloodstream, into the capillaries, and now our capillaries are going to be oxygenated to the maximum level. We can only go as high as 100, can't go above that because that's the highest. So oxygen enters the bloodstream, PO2 leaving the heart and the lungs is 100, heads down to the big toe. What do you suppose the oxygen level at your tissue cells is?
It's going to be lower.
It better be lower because the last time the blood went there, it dumped it off, and where did the oxygen go?
To yourself.
Inside the cell. So the tissue spaces is always lower than the blood, and it's usually sitting there at about 40 millimeters of mercury. So which way is the oxygen going to diffuse?
To the smaller concentration.
From the blood to the tissue spaces. It will then enter the cells. And what do you suppose your venous flow is going to be heading back? 40. So the venous flow, deoxygenated blood, PO2 is 40. Oh, look, I already told you that up here. Head to the lungs, you breathe more oxygen in. Oxygen diffuses into the bloodstream. Now we're oxygenated. We send it to the tissues. We dump it off. Deoxygenated back to the lungs. We pick up oxygen. We send it to the tissues. We dump it off. Get the story? Those are your numbers. 100 and 40. Now let's look at CO2. It's going to be the same, similar deal. Just different numbers and different gases. Different numbers, different gases. So, is your now we're thinking CO2, carbon dioxide. Which system is going to have a higher carbon dioxide level, your arteries or your veins? Your veins. So let's start at the level of the tissues here. Oxygen goes into the cell. What do we make? ATP. And what's a waste product? CO2. So CO2 is going to be released out of the cell. So at your tissue cells, spaces, you're going to have high CO2. And the number here is 46. 46 millimeters of mercury. Blood flow coming to the tissue spaces, the CO2 or partial pressure of CO2, in your arteries is lower. It's at 40. Which way is CO2 going to diffuse? From the tissue spaces into the capillary, the vein. So now leaving the tissue spaces, what's our PCO2 going to be? 46. We're going to send that 46 all the way up to the lung. PCO2 at the lung, 46. I'm sorry, and the bloodstream, the venous flow to the lung. Inside the lung, because we have now breathed out, we've breathed out CO2. In the lung, the PCO2 of carbon dioxide is 40. Which way is the CO2 going to flow now? From the bloodstream into the lungs. And now our arterial flow is going to be what number leaving? 40. CO2. Leaving the lung is 40. To the tissue spaces is 40. In the tissue spaces is 46. We pick up the excess. We max at 46. We send that to the lung. We dump it out to the lowest of 40. Arterial flow is 40. Venous flow is 46. So in your arteries, your PO2 is 100. Your PCO2 is 40. in your veins, your PO2 is 40, but your PCO2 is 46. So if you think about them together, the two numbers for PO2 is 100 and 40, for PCO2 is 40 and 46. Carbon dioxide is going to be high in your tissues, then higher in your veins. This is an image, a different image if you don't like my big toe guy. Here's your lung. Here's your tissue spaces. This is the alveolus, right? PO2 of venous flow is 40. In the alveolus, PO2 is 100. We diffuse out. Now our arterial flow is going to be 100. We head to the tissues, where we have lots of oxygen, but the tissues have less. So oxygen flows to the tissues, dumps off the oxygen. Now we're going to be lower at 40, and we head back up to the lung to pick up some more. We do the same story with PCO2. How is oxygen carried by the blood?
It binds to the subhuman and hemoglobins to the plasma.
Binds to hemoglobin. Right, that's the only way it's carried. It binds to hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide, however, is carried in one of three ways. One of three ways. One is bound to hemoglobin. It exchanges places with oxygen and can bind to hemoglobin. 23% of the CO2 that's produced as a waste product of cellular respiration, 23% is carried back to the lung, bound to hemoglobin. So, takes the place of oxygen. 7% is dissolved in plasma. Remember, I said that a gas under pressure dissolves in the liquid. So 7% is dissolved in the plasma. That leaves 70% of the CO2 we have to carry back to the lung in some kind of a mechanism. And the mechanism is this reaction. This is a very important reaction. Star, star, star. This is a big important reaction. At the tissue spaces, CO2 is produced. It is going to enter the red blood cell. It's going to enter the bloodstream. It's going to enter the red blood cell. It's going to unite with water. This is going to have a chemical reaction that's going to form a weak acid called carbonic acid. But carbonic acid doesn't hang around very long. It quickly dissociates into free hydrogen ions and another ion called bicarbonate. What do we know about free hydrogen ions?
It can make it more acidic.
It's acidic. It's a very strong acid. So, when the CO2 enters the red blood cell and has this reaction, it quickly breaks apart into free hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. What did I say hemoglobin also carries? Hydrogen ions. So hydrogen ions are going to be bound to the empty spaces on the hemoglobin that the oxygen got dumped off. Head back to the lung, and then this reaction is going to go in reverse. The bicarbonate will pull the hydrogen off the hemoglobin, combine to form a carbonic acid, and then break apart into CO2 and water. What do we breathe out? CO2 and water vapor, right? CO2 and water vapor. Let's see. I always try to draw this picture, and I can't say it's ever an amazing job, but we'll try. this is a vein. So CO2 is a waste product, right? CO2 is a waste product of cellular respiration. CO2 is going to leave the cell, and it has to be carried back to the lung so we can send that CO2 into the alveolus to be breathed out. We gotta get rid of CO2. And in the next section, we're gonna figure out why. Having CO2 stuck in your bloodstream is a bad thing. So, we gotta get rid of the CO2. We said it's carried in the blood 3 ways. 1, it'll exchange places with hemoglobin. 2, it'll dissolve in the plasma and just be heading back to the lung that way. And 3, it's gonna undergo this reaction. So what's gonna happen here is in the red blood cell, CO2 is gonna enter the red, that's an R. CO2 is gonna enter the red blood cell, and it's going to undergo this reaction. CO2 plus H2O is gonna get converted to H2CO3, which is gonna get converted to hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ion, HCO3. That reaction occurs inside the red blood cell. Okay? Hydrogen that is produced here is going to bind to hemoglobin. That makes it safe to carry. If it's free floating, it makes it acidic. So as long as it's bound to hemoglobin, we're good. So we're going to bind this hydrogen to hemoglobin. The bicarbonate is actually going to leave the cell, and that's going to head back up to the lung this way. Okay? So this is going to be bound to hemoglobin. We hooked up with hemoglobin inside the red blood cell. Bicarbonate leaves. Now we head back up to the lung. We carry that red blood cell back up to the lung. At the lung, we got to get rid of the CO2. So what's going to happen is hydrogen is going to be pulled off the hemoglobin. Bicarbonate ion is going to re-enter the red blood cell. And we're going to send this reaction the other direction. We're going to convert it into H2CO3, and we're going to convert that into CO2 plus H2O. And what are we going to get rid of?
CO2.
CO2 plus H2O. No, we don't get rid of all the water, but some of it. Especially the CO2. That's what we need to get rid of. So then we can pick up more oxygen, send it over here, dump off our oxygen, pick up the CO2, carry it back to the lung to get rid of it in one of those 3 ways. Exchanging for oxygen, dissolving the plasma, or this big important reaction right here. This picture comes from your book. It's this, but it makes no sense to me. If you like it, have at her. I don't like it, but I like this better. I don't care about it. We know that the brainstem controls ventilation, right? Brainstem keeps your basic function alive, maintains breathing. We've also got chemoreceptors. A chemoreceptor detects chemicals. Chemoreceptors in our aorta and our carotid artery, and they detect changes in oxygen levels, pH levels, carbon dioxide levels, and if any of those are too high or too low, our ventilation will change. If your CO2 is too high, you're going to breathe faster to get rid of it. If your oxygen level is too low, you're going to breathe faster to get more in. So your ventilation, your breathing rate changes because of these peripheral chemoreceptors, meaning they're in the outskirts. They're not in your central nervous system. We also have chemoreceptors in our central nervous system, And because CO2 can't cross the blood-brain barrier, but hydrogen can, we detect hydrogen levels in the central nervous system. So if your central nervous system becomes too acidic or basic, it's going to send a signal to your medulla oblongata and your pons and tell you to change ventilation. You're either going to breathe faster or slower. You can cross this off. You can cross off the protective reflexes. So, they'll say baroreceptors, but your chemoreceptors are found here in the aorta and carotid. I told you about this, right? We did that last time. Now, I want to talk about this. This is the important reaction. And when you get into healthcare, one of the things that you're going to keep an eye on very, very closely is the gases, ABGs, arterial blood gases, and pH. Because people can become acidic, and that's a big deal. And people can become basic, and that's a big deal. Because if you are outside your physiological pH range, what happens?
Your breathing gets.
Well, what happens to yourself? What happens to you when your pH gets too acidic or too basic?
It'll destroy your red blood cells.
How?
Red cells. Because your blood cells need to be in a certain.
Yes. Remember, we have to have our pH between 7.35 and 7.45, right about 7.4. And what happens when your pH gets too low? We denature proteins, right? And proteins make us, so we have to have our proteins intact. So this reaction is going to be important. This is messed up. This should be over here. So I'm going to rewrite this because I don't like this. This reaction is important for understanding how CO2 is going to be a big deal looking at it's one of our ABGs, our arterial blood gases that we need to keep track of. So let's rewrite this. CO2 plus H2O gets converted to H2CO3, which is called carbonic acid, which is a weak acid. And that breaks apart very quickly. This doesn't hang out very long into free hydrogen ions, which is a strong acid, and bicarbonate ions, which are important because they like to pull hydrogens out of solution and buffer these strong acids. So this is bicarbonate. Okay, that's another important ion. So go to the last section where it says respiratory acidosis, respiratory alkalosis, metabolic acidosis, metabolic alkalosis. Okay, we've already talked about all this other stuff and that our pH must be maintained right at about 7.4. And how can all of this change? How does breathing affect pH? This is the whole point of that first section when I said, what's the job of the respiratory system? Well, we exchange gases and we speak and we regulate pH. And most people don't realize that your breathing can alter your pH, and this is how we do it. Respiratory acidosis. This is a condition in which there's something wrong with your respiratory system that is making you acidic. There's something wrong with your respiratory system. You have a disease, you have a condition affecting your respiratory system, and it's making you acidic. Here's your key here. CO2 and hydrogen are connected. If I have too much CO2 in my blood, what's going to happen here? If I have too much CO2, does my body have plenty of water? I hope so. It's 50 to 60% water. So will there always be water for CO2 to bind to? Yes. So if I have excess CO2 and it combines with the plenty of water that I have, and we convert it to carbonic acid, which then quickly gets converted to hydrogen and bicarb, what happens to my hydrogen ions if I have too much CO2? Do they go up or down? They go up. And if I have too much hydrogen ions, what happens to me?
You become acidic.
I become acidic. My pH goes below 7.4. Can you think of a respiratory condition in which you would not get rid of CO2? It would stay in your bloodstream. What else? COPD. Umbrella term. Give me some forms of COPD. Emphysema. That's not right. I'm not spelling that right. I don't know what that is. Emphysema. I think it's an E. What else? Come on. What reduces gas exchange? At the level of the lung. Oh, let's think COVID pneumonia here. People with COVID, in which their lungs are being destroyed, they can't get rid of CO2. Guess what a byproduct of that is?
It's becoming acidic.
Acidosis. Respiratory acidosis. What else? That's all I got.
Smoking?
Bronchitis. Nah. Smoking is more.
Asthma?
Could be. Yeah. Sort of a temporary. Asthma. That's not right either. I'm having a hard time with spelling today. Pneumonia, bronchitis, asthma, fibrosis, where the lung tissue loses its ability to be lung tissue and turns into fiber. So that means we can't breathe the CO2 out. If you can't breathe it out, where does it stay? In your blood. And this is what happens. And you get too many free hydrogen ions and you become acidic. Respiratory acidosis. Okay? Let's do the opposite. What's respiratory alkalosis mean? Now you've got a respiratory condition in which, what are we going to do here?
Too basic.
Yep. So, what do I have to do to CO2?
Get rid of too much.
I have to get rid of too much CO2. So I lose CO2, which then means I don't have enough free hydrogen ions, which means I'm going to become
Too basic.
basic, so my pH is going to go up above 7.4. Can you give me a condition in which that might happen? How could you get rid of too much CO2?
Breathing too. Like high blood pressure?
You have the right start. Hyper ventilating. Hysterical hyperventilating. You're breathing too fast, getting rid of too much CO2, pushes the reaction this way, we lose free hydrogen ions, and we can become basic. Hysterical hyperventilating. Tell a quick story. 20 years ago, my husband and I he won a trip to Thailand. And we spent a week in Thailand with 400 other people. It was a big sales thing. Anyway, so we spent, I don't know, 3 days in Bangkok, and then we went down to Phuket, which is a resort island south of Bangkok, south of Thailand. And every day you could go do fun stuff, right? And then we were on an amazing, beautiful beach, and everything was 5-star. I mean, it was the most awesome trip ever. So one of the days, we chose to go on a boat ride to go snorkeling on some island called PP Islands, which is out in the sea. So we get on the boat, we drove for 3 hours, and we get to the island, and we pull up to the island, and we eat lunch, and then they separate us. There was probably 50 people on this trip. They separate us into groups of 4, and we get into what's called a long-tail boat. And a long-tail boat is basically a tree trunk, kind of. It's a big, long, skinny boat. And there's a guy that's running the boat, a Thai guy that's got an engine on the end of a pole. And he's there, and he's going to drive us out to this reef, which is, I don't know, 100 feet off of the beach. And so we get into the boats, and our boat had a leak in it. And so besides driving, our little guy is dumping water out. I don't swim. And so, I mean, I can, kind of. I don't swim good. So we're on a boat with my husband and this other couple, and we get out 100 feet off the shore, and people are just piling. I mean, they've got their flippers on and their little snorkel stuff on, and they're piling out of their boats, and they're swimming along. And the lady that was with us, she starts getting off the ladder, and the boat shifted and smacked her in the head. I'm like, oh my God. And my husband bails. He's gone. He's 25, he's gone. And I'm sitting in there, and I am watching this poor lady who just got smacked in the head, and the guy who's dumping water out of the boat, and I start to panic, and I start to hyperventilate. And and I'm slowly putting my fins on just to pretend I'm doing something while I'm watching everybody. And finally my husband turns around, he's like, oh, where's Pam? And he yells at me, come on, it's so cool, you gotta come out. I said, I don't think I can. There were no life jackets, not a life jacket, at least on our boat. So there I am, I swim like a rock. And I couldn't do it. I said, I can't do it, I can't do it. And he comes swimming over, and he says, yeah, you just have to, just try. Fine. So I put my fins on, I put my mask on, I got on the ladder, I put my face in, I came out, and I came back in the boat. I said, I can't do it. See, I don't know how long I hyperventilated, but it was a while. Anyway, so he says, well, what if I get you a life jacket? I don't know if I can. I might just take the boat back. I don't know. So he finds a life jacket for me, and by that time I'm calmed down, and I get my life jacket, and well, then it was amazing, because I didn't have to worry about dying, right? I will never snorkel without a life jacket ever again, ever. Not that I have since, but when we did go snorkeling later, I did have my life jacket. And I didn't care if I looked like a dork or not. So if you think about hyperventilating, what do they do to get you to, what do you do to fix hyperventilating? Breathe in a bag. Why?
Because it sends CO2 back in.
Because you're rebreathing CO2. So if you breathe in a bag, you rebreathe the CO2, which brings this up, which then brings that up, which then brings your pH up. Now, I hadn't even started teaching this class yet. This is before I even started teaching this class. Had I thought about this, what do you suppose, after I finally calmed down from my panic attack, what do you suppose my ventilation rate was like? Do you think I was breathing faster or slower? Way slower. Right. Because I didn't have a bag to breathe in, and I didn't think about that. But in order to bring this back up, I wanted to keep my CO2 in my bloodstream, so my ventilation rate is probably like 1 breath a minute. I mean, honestly, I probably didn't even need my little cookie thing, you know? Could have just swam by around the top. All right, metabolic acidosis. Now this is a metabolic situation, a metabolic condition in which you're going to become acidic. A metabolic situation in which we're going to become acidic. So we're going to have too many hydrogens here because of some kind of metabolic problem. Some kind of metabolic problem. Ketoacidosis. Diabetic ketoacidosis. Diabetics who are not taking care of themselves, they're not using their insulin, break down fats too quickly, they make ketone bodies. Ketone bodies are acidic. Increase your hydrogens. So that's one example. Lactic acidosis. This is a condition in which usually doesn't occur very often, but it can when you've got muscle damage. Really very, very excessive exercise can produce lactic acidosis. Remember, I said most people don't make so much lactic acid because their brain says, I want to quit before I work out too hard, but some people can. So we've got an acidic condition. I got too many hydrogens. How can my breathing help my pH? Do you think my breathing, if I've got too many hydrogens, do you think my breathing is going to increase or decrease? So you want my breathing to slow down. You want me to keep CO2 and make myself more acidic.
You're going to be breathing faster to get
Yes.
CO2.
Yes. I want to push this reaction this way. I want to breathe faster. I want to pull those hydrogens with the CO2 and get rid of them. So my breathing is going to slow down. Ventilation, I'm sorry, my breathing will speed up. My breathing will speed up. Like, that's not right. It's going to go faster. Ventilation rates for people who are in acidosis is going to be faster. Ketoacidosis, respiratory rate will be faster. Okay, metabolic alkalosis. Now I don't have enough hydrogens. What's going to happen to my breathing rate? I'm going to slow down. I want to go slow because I want to keep the CO2 in my blood. I don't want to breathe it out so that I can raise that up, right? CO2 and the hydrogens are connected. Make sure you, that's why I got stars above them. How could we have metabolic alkalosis? Excessive vomiting can result in alkalosis. Too much Tums, eating too many Rolaids can actually produce metabolic alkalosis because you're pulling the hydrogens out. Loss of hydrogens, excessive vomiting. Or excessive diarrhea, where we lose too much bicarb. If you lose too much of your buffer, you can, sorry, that would be an acidosis situation. Too much diarrhea would be an acidosis. Excessive diarrhea. Now you know how you're breathing can change your breathing. All because of this reaction.